the two that have followed to that. And I think it was, what I really wanted to do was to try and reflect on what the point of those meetings were, what were the motivations for it. And the motivations behind OpenCon were really, at its development, were really to focus on young researchers, actually more than that, young scholars, as agents of change. And as you've heard, to a certain extent, we're probably preaching to the choir here to a very large extent. So what I wanted to do was not sort of reflect on how you might be able to go out and be more effective, but how in those moments where it's tough, where it's difficult, where it's frustrating, and I know I already had some conversations with some of you about how it can be continually frustrating to try and advocate for more open practice, what we can do to strengthen our own selves and to think carefully about what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. So frequently in these conversations, we'll talk about the what. And we've already heard that it's difficult to say what is open. And we tend to revert to talking about licensing and accessibility and barriers and those kinds of things. And we can have that conversation. We'll talk about this, no doubt, over the course of the afternoon. But we've had a conversation, and sometimes we haven't agreed as to what the right conclusions are, perhaps. But it's one that we've had and one that we continue to have as part of this change in society. So let's not talk about. We might also want to talk about the who. In a world that is changing, and it's easy to focus on, those of us who have been in this space or talked or written this for some period of time, and somehow we are allowed to label ourselves as being open access people, open data people, open advocacy people. And we might sometimes, particularly in the world we're living at the moment, where in a sense we've actually had enormous success, ask some questions about who gets to call themselves that. We're certainly in a world where organisations that traditionally have not been open are claiming that they are, and that's not always something that we would want to support. I will say that there are genuinely in some of those organisations, or some of those organisations and some of the people in them are genuinely trying to change what they are doing with more or less success. And should we stop them from being able to claim some of that label if that sense of engagement is genuine? And how can we tell whether it's genuine? Because we know that in many cases it is just trying to take advantage of it. We are seeing open washing of various different types in the world around us. So how can we tell when those organisations are genuinely engaging and genuinely trying to change? And if they are genuinely trying, what can we do to help? And when they're not genuine, how can we spot that and call it out? Maybe there's something on the flip side of that as well. Those organisations, those people who have sometimes maybe made big contributions in the past, but are they getting a free pass now? How do we hold people and organisations to account to make sure they're still delivering? Who gets to wear that label is an important question. But it's also not really what I want to talk about. And to answer that question, we have to address the how. How can we be open? And I think this starts to get to a more interesting question for this kind of group, because it's not easy. It's not easy. There are challenges. There are challenges in tackling existing systems. There are challenges in working within the environments that we find ourselves in, particularly for people early in their career looking to forge some sort of path towards making a difference, possibly looking to ensure that you can pay off student loans. There are difficult choices to be made about how far you want to push, who you want to push, and how you want to go about doing that. And there are risks. And I'm sure we'll talk throughout the course about strategies that are effective and maybe some of those that are less than effective. What's important, and perhaps the finding out that we thought were important that maybe are less of an issue than we thought they were. Or maybe things that we didn't think were important that turn out to be much more important than we thought they were. But again, that's not actually what I talk about. I wanted to pose the question not what objects are open and which ones are closed, or as John Wilbanks would say, which ones are open and which ones are broken. Not who gets to label themselves and whether we should parcel that out or trademark it. Not even so much the processes, the ideas, the things that are the ways in which we achieve this, but to go back right to the core principles of why is open. Why do we think this is important? And there are big answers to that. Answers that refer to issues of inclusion, issues of democracy, of access, health and the environment, the commitment, the idea that by being open we make a better world because people can have access to knowledge, because people can contribute to knowledge. And I'm sure many of those things are shared by many of the people today. But I think it's important to recognise that we don't all share all of them. And it's important to ask some hard questions about how actually we're delivering on them. Open data is a step in the right direction in many ways for helping people to engage with society around them, but is it actually enhancing democracy? Is it actually enhancing inclusion? And there's a fair amount of evidence out there that many of the ways we're doing this, while necessary steps in that direction, are not actually delivering anything beyond the kind of engagement from the kind of people who are already involved in conventional democratic politics. We're in a library, in an education institution that is 800 years old, where people have to pay to study. We can have this conversation, but what does it mean to really include people beyond that? And I'm not saying that to challenge you or to make you feel about what you should have done this morning or what you maybe should do tomorrow, because the different aspects of working towards this make a difference. But I do want to challenge you to think about whether those aspects of the process that matter to you are things we're actually delivering on. In the world of open access, we've got to the point where we're doing a much better job of throwing those articles over the fence of the ivory tower, but are we actually putting them in the forms and places where the people we've talked about having access to them can actually use them? Do we need to think about translation of all sorts of different types to make that work in practice? How do we make data actually usable and used? And how could we measure that? How could we measure the things that we actually care about, as opposed to the things that are easy or, as it turns out in a preprint with Stuart Lawson and others recently, turns out to be quite hard to actually measure. Even the trivial stuff of whether articles are accessible and how much is being paid for them is hard to measure. How can we actually get a handle on whether they are in fact being used, whether in fact they are reaching those places, the patients, the parents, the members of society, the members of other societies who don't speak our language, whether that's the language of science or the language of English, that they can actually understand it. So that's a challenge, I think, for all of us to think about what it is that motivates us. What are the big issues and how can we test whether we're delivering on them? But I wanted to go a little deeper than that, because each of us, I'm sure, has a reason, a personal why, for how we became involved in this. It might range from personal stories of loss, personal stories where a lack of access or a lack of ability to engage was a serious personal problem. It might emerge from a lifelong engagement with principles around access and knowledge. It might be a frustration. It might have been something that was actually self-interest. I can certainly say for myself, one of the reasons that I got into this in the first place, and one of the reasons that I keep doing it, was because it led to success, because people were reading what I was doing. And I'm sure there wouldn't be no one who was actually got into it in the first place, somebody. So those whys matter, because those whys are at the centre of the story we tell ourselves about how we came into this space and what we do. And I think it's important because those whys are often not shared. And that matters because right at the heart of those whys, there is a tension. There's a tension we don't often talk about, because one of those whys, one of those personal motivations, is about freedom. Perhaps best expressed by Richard Stallman in The Freedoms of Use for Free Software. It's about what I can do. And there's a why, which is about communities coming together and collaboration and contribution and working as a community to do things we wouldn't be able to otherwise. And one of the things we don't talk about are that those two things are in tension with each other. Freedom, the freedom to use, the freedom to access, the freedom to read, to repurpose, to remix, it's part of a set of values of a community. But when you choose to belong to a community, you choose to give up freedoms. And that's not something we've talked about very much. It's not something we've talked about in part because of the way we've constructed the entire debate around openness, as though it's a shift from a world in which copyright and private property reigns to a world in which we're constructing a pure public good in which everyone can share in everything. But if we're actually changing the way people can interact with knowledge, if we have to think about translation, it's never going to be a truly freely available public good. It's always going to be tied up in communities. And those different communities and those differing communities, which some of us have argued about the principles of, are in those different personal stories of why we came into this. And that we need to think about what it means, what our shared culture, if you like, is, how our communities work and how we construct communities and commons if we're going to successfully change the world by taking the culture of our community and spreading it more widely. So if you're with anything, I want to leave you with this question that is a question. Why did you come here today? What is it that drives you to be involved with and engaged with these ideas? And to ask each other that. What is different about the person next to you? And the people that we disagree with, particularly given that it is the disagreements within our community that we are most passionate about. Isn't that a strange? It's easy to reject the arguments about copyright maximalism in a closed world. And yet we end up arguing amongst ourselves about whether one should allow viral licensing or not. So ask that question, why? Because at the root of this, for me, the point that this isn't actually a question. The point of being open, of creating communities of knowledge, communities for knowledge, is so that we can engage with the process. I chose this shirt not just because I had my roots in the sciences and not just because I was coming to Cambridge, so I wanted to try and annoy the historians, but to remind me, in a sense, that there is more to this than the sciences, that the human sciences, we have this problem in English. To talk about sciences is different to the humanities, whereas in other European languages, they're the same thing. There's this separation. And so this question of why we do something. I'm sure we will have children. Some of you Well, most of you have probably been children at some point. But that thing of why? But why? No, but really, but why? That we think of as irritating, but which is actually at the root of why we are here. So I want to leave you not with a question, but with a statement. That why is open. And thank you.